I'm Joey Lee Cabral. Today we're going to be doing an ink wash tutorial. We're going to do two different subjects today. One of them, we're going to be showing you guys how we did this hand painting, done primarily just in ink and water. And we're also going to be doing this tree and tree trunk. I'm a comic book illustrator. This is a process that I use in all of my pieces for both sequential work and for illustration. Ink wash is important to all mediums. It can be used for your foundation, for watercolor, for acrylics, and for oil. It helps give you all of the values and the important information that you're going to need initially so that you can build on as you go through the painting. So for today's pieces, we use the Higgins waterproof drawing ink for the hand, and we use the Bombay Black India ink for the tree. We used a toothbrush. It could be any toothbrush, your kids' old toothbrushes, which those are usually mine. We used some weathered brushes that would have been in retirement, but we found them a new meaning and purpose today. We just used the regular palette. This is just to basically rub our ink against on the brush. I used a 2H pencil. For me, this is the preference. It doesn't leave a lot of lead tracings behind on your paint on your pieces, and it's really easy to pick up. We used the round brush for the washes, and kind of to tighten up some of the wash, we used also the flat brush as well. This is going to be the number 4 Master's Touch brush. This is just for the finer details, making sure that we're getting exactly what we want on the strokes. The gum eraser, this helps a lot with making sure that there's no oils left on the eraser when you're erasing your pieces. Sometimes you'll get smudge marks. So this is a great tool to use. It does make a lot of mess, but it is very helpful with keeping everything really clean, not letting oils from your hand seep onto your canvas. Use a damp cloth. This is just to take off some of the excess water that's on your brushes, but without removing all of the ink on it. Just a cup for water. Artist tape, you can use just the white tape or the blue tape for painters, but I do recommend that if you use non-artist tape that you do remove it immediately after your wash. Giving it a day or two to sit on the paper, the adhesive becomes more attached to the paper and will lift the paper, tearing it. So you do have to be really careful when it's not the artist tape. All right, so first I'm going to just kind of sketch and mess with the composition on the paper, see what kind of fits in terms of its form. So we're going to probably draw a few different shapes, and then we're going to pick the ones that we like. An important part of the foundation is doing your homework first, studying what you're going to be drawing, knowing what shapes are incorporated with what you're drawing, and then deciding what's going to be important to the piece that you're doing. Your composition is a little different from photography. You're going to try to think of what the viewer is going to see through your imagination. So you want to make sure that you interpret the right things so that a viewer can kind of see the perspective that you're trying to show them. And so these big shapes right here for like the wrist and the palm and the fingers, if I draw all of this now, when I'm inking, I know which direction to flow with the ink strokes. And that's going to give us a lot of form in the drawing. So we got the palm under here. We got a knuckle. Your thumb on a hand is usually a reflection of your pinky. So whatever direction you're going with on your thumb, your pinky will most of the time reflect that. So in Tom Lea's work, he was great at his composition. So on a page, the way that we try to show people an illustration is you have $100 to spend on the intention of the viewer. In that $100, you want to spend, let's say, $30 on the focal point, and then spend the rest of the money on the rest of the page. If everything is important, then nothing's important to the viewer. So you want to make sure that you're just focusing on the parts that you want the viewer to see. So in this right here, this is already enough of the foundation that we can start to build the inks. What we're going to do first is lay down some of the black lines that are going to be important for our foundation so that when we add the ink wash, we don't lose all of this important information as we go. And you don't need a lot of ink. A very little will go a really long way. Tom Lea had a very, very clean style, especially with his values. They transitioned seamlessly. And that's something that's really, really hard to do for illustrators. And especially with all of the techniques that we use now, he really had the fundamentals of kind of like the old way to do artwork. So what I'm going to do here is kind of just build the hardest values that we're going to have throughout the painting. Even if your drawing has a lot of light, try not to avoid adding enough black to set the composition for your painting. A lot of artists will avoid using really heavy black lines, but a lot of this is important for your eye to tell you what's going to be in shadow and what's going to be in light. So we are going to do the wash on this. What I'm going to try to do is just capture some of the shapes that are in this form. So that when we put the ink wash on there, we have some of that information under it. You don't need to ink before you do the wash, but if you've tried ink wash before and you're not happy with the results, try switching it to this. Build your foundation first. Don't be afraid of how dark something is. With the hand, it's great because we get to use our own references. So you can take pictures of your hand. I've used it in several pieces of my own hands, but it's something visually that we have to kind of help us see what we're looking at on paper. If I'm stuck, I can, pose my hand in the same direction and be like, oh, I have this and I have these, and I can add all that information on there. So we have enough of the drawing in terms of its shapes and some of the lines that we want to make sure that we keep in on the wash here. What I'm going to do is just give it a second to dry up all the way. We're going to clean it up and then we're going to spray it down and do the ink wash on it. All right, so now I'm going to be erasing all of the pencil lines. We're going to just make sure that it's a pretty clean paper. You can leave these on here, but sometimes that information does not get picked up after we put the inks on it. It almost seals it, so we want to make sure it's pretty clean before we do the ink wash. So with inking, you really only have to let it dry for a few minutes. I would recommend the gum eraser. If you use the silicone erasers, sometimes they hold oils from your fingers, and if you try to erase, you'll get a smudge. It's usually because of the eraser that you're using. This one, it makes a complete mess, but it's going to keep your painting as pristine as possible. Kneaded erasers are also really good to use. Those ones you can work it to get it clean. The only thing is that in your art bag, you may collect debris from pencil shavings or ink that could be transferred onto your canvas. Okay, so now we're going to be doing the ink wash. What I'd recommend throughout the entire process is to keep your brushes primed. If you let ink sit on your brushes, it'll mess up the nibs of the brush and they're going to kind of flare out. So just to keep them handy is just to keep them primed with water throughout the entire process that you're doing the wash. So we're going to be using a round ink brush for the wash. This is going to be the number 20. You want to get something pretty big to do an even wash. You're also going to need a spray bottle, some water nearby, and then the ink that you're going to be using as your well. On your wash, make sure that you keep it fairly even. If you notice a lot of buckling in your paper, it's because you have isolated spots of water that are not even throughout the entire piece. If you have an even wash of water throughout your entire piece, it'll keep it from an even buckle so that you could just kind of set it under a book and keep it flat in the future. This is very important to the fundamentals of using your ink wash. Tom Lea would have used the same approach in his paper, is to treat it the same way. So on the wash, you want to have it consistent. You want to have it wet, but also not any, try to avoid having too many puddles. That's going to kind of make your water and your ink go all to one side of the canvas. So just try to keep it even. So we're going to just give it a second and let it kind of rest. We also are going to be moving the canvas a little bit. So the reason why it's taped down is we're going to get the wash going, but we're going to have to manipulate where the ink goes. We want to keep most of the light off of the hand. So we're going to go really dark on the edges, but we want to gradually build in the values towards the center. The way I learned ink washing was through videos online, through artists that I know, people that have used the medium, and a lot of practice. Some of the feedback that you get early on with being an artist is to keep on drawing. And that's one of the worst things that we hate to hear as artists, but it's the most important thing. Nothing is going to get you more experience, more exposure than just drawing. The more you put pen to paper, the more you're going to learn what works and what doesn't work. And also you're going to learn what you like and don't like. So remember, on your wash, you can keep on building values, but it's harder to take away values. So when you're building up the levels of black that you're using, just make sure that you're using a transition throughout the piece. Don't worry about making it perfect. You're just trying to create. So what you can learn from this piece to fix in the future, you fix it on a future project. Don't get stuck on thinking this is the piece that has to be perfect. The other thing is that it's going to look really, really dark initially, and then as it dries, it does get lighter. It starts to bleed into the paper, and your base is all white, so it's going to kind of even out a little bit. We're going to spray a little bit of water just to get a little bit of a cleaner transition between the grays. So the brush strokes matter in the sense that you want to make sure that you're kind of keeping the form of the painting. If you want it to be very rigid, you can use the square brush. If you want it to be very smooth, you can use the round brush. Just make sure that you're kind of keeping that in mind. With the foundation that we're using this, we want to go pretty dark on the background. So we're not really too worried about what we're getting on the initial wash. This is just something as a placeholder so that we can build off of. See all these little shapes that we kind of laid down with the inks. We know that those are the direction of the brush stroke that we're going to go. So if it flares out this way, we're going to flare out the same direction of the strokes that are under it. So now what I'm going to be using is a toothbrush, and the toothbrush is going to be used with just black ink. It's going to go into the wash and just kind of create some more of the values, so make sure that we're focusing just on this part of the hand. Right now, the light source is perfect to myself. I might go a little bit darker, but you want to make sure that you save your lights throughout the entire process. Once we cover those values, if I covered this hand or the finger, we can't really go back without adding white paint. We can still do that if we need to, but we want to try to avoid that in the wash process. So right now we have a lot of brush strokes. I'm not really too worried about it since this is the foundation. As we keep on going, we're going to keep on layering it more and more. You can make this transition smoother if you add more water and just a broader wash. This one was intentional. We're going to keep on building from it. We're going to add the more ink with the toothbrush. This is going to give us like a splatter effect, but it's going to also give us kind of a focal point for the painting. This process was most likely done with paintbrush, but tools improve, and stuff that we have available to us at every home can become a tool that we keep on using into our process. Okay, so right now the painting is somewhat dry in some spots and wet in others. If we feel it, it's still pretty damp. I'm sure it's pretty wet here, but we can still, now we can add more values and go darker. What we don't want to do is make sure we avoid using ink next to the puddles that we don't want information to get pushed. So if this is too wet and I use ink and it blows out into the hand, we might lose the hand. So we just want to make sure that we're kind of being careful on this part. But trust the process. If you don't like the way that something looks in the middle of your painting, remind yourself that it's also not finished and you need to keep on going. But don't give up. So we're going to go in there, round brush still. If I start to work in a new ink too early, the values will keep on getting pushed with the canvas if there's too much water present on it. So it's important just to let it dry a little bit. Right now it's damp to the touch, so we want to try to make sure that we're adding in these values, especially on the part that we consider the wash, because we want it to be kind of, we want it to transition smoothly throughout the piece. So we're going to add a little bit of black closer to the hand. And remember, on all of your ink pieces, you can go back in with acrylic or watercolor and paint over it. You would just basically do just a quick wash, a skin tone, and all your values are going to stay there on the painting under it. So all that information that you're doing now is going to be used later. In comic books, we have a rule when you're working on a page or a piece that you try to do like a 70-30 split between your white and your black on your canvas. So if the painting is primarily black, you want to leave 30% of it white. If the painting is primarily white, you want to have 30% that is black. This is going to help with your composition to make sure that the viewer sees the stuff that is important in your piece. Remember that different paper gives you different textures, so don't stay stuck on one brand. Try different brands. Make sure at least that it is a mixed medium or a watercolor paper. If you use sketchbook paper, it's going to just wrinkle up and it won't hold the water very well. So right now I'm just kind of feathering in. I have a little bit of black right here, so I'm just going to try to work it into the painting a little bit more. Then we're going to go back in with the toothbrush and a little bit of the water bottle just to get a little bit more textures on the background. So right now I'm going to add a little bit more values to the hand. We're going to try to go mainly water, but it still might have like a little tint of the ink in it. If you've seen Tom Lea's ink work, some of it looks like he's cheating because of how good his ink washes are and how seamlessly they transition between each other. But that is a person that was truly a master of his craft. So I do think I will get there one day, but I'm not there yet. So again, we're just keeping form. Okay, so now we're going to let it dry all the way. Basically, when it's done, all we're going to do is just tighten up the shadow that's closest to the hand. Make sure that it's a darker value placement than the hand is itself, and to make sure that it drops to the background. So now we're going to be doing a tree branch with the tree trunk. We're going to just use the information that we know from real life to inform our decision and help us kind of use that as a reference to what we're going to be drawing. We don't want to use references to dictate what we're going to be drawing. We're going to use them to inform us. No one's going to look at what you used as a reference or go look for the tree that you drew. Just make sure that you're having fun, that you're making some changes that you think are important to the piece. First, we already have our foundation, so we're going to do the same technique. We're going to have some of the ink lines, except this time we're going to use primarily just the wash and build off of that. So no hard lines initially, just the simple values laid down first. This is also a good time to get out your not so perfect brushes and you're going to use these ones, these are going to create a lot of character in your piece. You don't want something that's very clean for a tree trunk. You want it to be very organic and do things that you don't want it to do. And these brushes are going to help us do that. So same process here. We're going to first get our ink wash in. We're going to let that water kind of sit here a little bit, touch a little bit of the ink. A simpler way to do what I'm doing right now is you can have multiple cups, and what you can do is use your droplet to add ink to every one of the cups, a different measurement. So on the first cup, you can have 5 drips of the black ink introduced into water. The second one, you could have 3, 2, 1, so that you have an even wash and you have it consistent throughout the entire piece. So for this one, I didn't want to use the ink wash to dictate all of the values on the piece. I want the tree trunk to be a separate value from the background. So I'm going with the background first. I'm using the negative space in your reference or your drawing to dictate what the form is going to be. So this is kind of just more experimenting. This is not being very stuck on what you're drawing and just trying to have fun with it. The tree trunk is a great example of just something that you can do that looks organic. There's already some mistakes that I didn't initially want in the form of the trunk that's giving us, the eye is filling in that information. So this little bump looks like a knot on a tree. That's just something that the ink gave us. So we're going to kind of let the ink dictate what the piece is going to look like. Remember, on your drawing, when you're sketching, if you're trying to learn or if you're just practicing, try not to keep so many rules in your head about the process of something. If you make it so that it's not fun, it's more likely that you don't go back to it. So just enjoy it. Let the mistakes kind of inform what you're going to do on the next piece. What I don't like in this piece, I'll make sure to fix in the future pieces. So on this piece, we're able to use this technique because it's an organic form. If we were drawing something like the hand that we drew or a building, we want to make sure that all that information is present on the foundation of the piece. On this piece, since it's going to have, if it would have grass or mountains, those things are organic, they're just nature, so we don't have to be very strict on what we're drawing. So that's why we're using this technique. Always prime your brushes between washes. Try not to leave ink on your brush. It'll make them very hard on the tip. Also, on your cup of water, don't let your water pass the point of the metal. If you do, the water will seep into the wood and the metal and lose the glue that's in between it, and then you'll have a very loose nib. You can fix it with pliers, but after that, your brush is kind of just wearing out faster than you want it to be. So this is a brush that should have been retired, but artists can't throw away brushes. So we try to keep them until we have a use for them. So this brush has lost half the side of it, but it's great for textures. So we're going to kind of use it as an ink wash, and that's going to give us some of the tree trunk impressions. With this part, we want to make sure that we're keeping the form of the tree in mind. So we want to make sure that all of the strokes are in the direction that we want them to go. We're actually going to use another brush to do some contour lines to give it that tree bark impression. And remember that the brush that you're using, it could be any type of worn brush. And just use it on a simple scratch sheet of paper, see which textures you like, and from that, use it to introduce it into your painting. So on paintbrushes, you want to make sure that you're looking for the water-based brushes. They have different textures on it. Nylon, the the synthetic horsehair, all those are going to be really great. If there's too much texture on it with ink and with watercolor, you're going to get a lot of textures that you might not want in a piece that's usually smaller. You're going to look for firm brushes for like acrylic or your oil-based paintings, but for your ink wash, try to keep them very soft. And really, you just want to make sure that the form is what you like. If it's a round edge, the narrow point, or the flat head, it's just whatever you're trying to go for on your piece. For your ink brush, just to kind of keep it damp but not completely dry, I would recommend having a wet paper towel nearby so that you can kind of just do simple strokes on it. So that way you're not removing all of the ink from it, but you're keeping it damp so you can keep on using it on your canvas. So for this piece, we just build the values with the ink wash. This one didn't have a lot of foundational work, so we're kind of just building it as we go. We're letting the tree kind of dictate what we want for the look. You can have a small reference for this. If you wanted to draw something very similar, you can make it really small so that you have all the composition that you need and that you're going to use to influence your bigger pieces. Remember that all of your fundamentals are still important. You got your form, your source lighting, your rim lighting. Make sure all that information is there initially if you have a hard time with that information being introduced at the end of the pieces. In my mind, I have kind of like a vision of what I want for the piece, so that's what I'm going off of, but you use references, models, whatever helps you create something that you enjoy. So right now I'm going to be using the toothbrush to add in some more textures. We're also going to use my fingerprint on this lighter part. Your fingerprints, for the most part, have a lot of great organic textures that you can add. And it's going to give that impression of tree trunks. It's going to give that impression of skin. You can use it on all of the pieces that you're using. So give me 1 second. We're going to get that on here. So just to show you guys the difference between inks, this is India ink from Bombay. This one usually has a little bit of a warmer base. So when you do the wash, you're going to get a little bit of warmer values. You might see it in different lighting. This one is going to be the same type of ink, but it's waterproof. So what this is used for usually is for illustrations. You can use it for newsprint. And if you look at it right now, it almost looks like a copy from a Xerox because it has no other values besides black and white. On your India ink, this one is easier to introduce watercolors and paints afterwards. If I try to introduce skin tones to this hand with this base, I will kind of fight a little bit with the level of black and grays that are inside of the base of the painting. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing is you can use Bristol board. I would not recommend vellum paper. The smooth is going to be almost have no texture. So when you're doing your wash, it's kind of just going to flow everywhere. Try to get something with a little bit of tooth. Something that I do that may look weird to people that are shopping is I'll go and I'll fill every single piece of paper that's inside of the sketchbooks because I'm looking for something that feels a little bit gritty. If you get something that has too much texture, it's going to dictate how well you illustrate something. So if you get something that's in between, it feels pretty smooth, but you're going to get a little bit of a resistance from your brush. That's what you want. If it's really, really heavy watercolor paper, there's almost going to be no drawing that you can do on it that's going to come out well. All of your lines are going to come out really rigidy, a lot of shakiness in your line weight and on your strokes. So just make sure that you're getting something that's in between the two. Let me go ahead and erase the pencil marks. We're still going to do a little bit more value building in here, but now what we want is a clean palette so that we know what the end piece is going to look like. Remember, if you don't like your piece at this point, remind yourself that you're not finished. A lot of artists give up, especially because it's frustrating. Sometimes we get too narrow-minded and tunnel visioned in what we're drawing. We think that we need to perfect it or fix it at that moment. I promise you that if you kind of just leave a painting there, let it sit for a day, go back to it, you're going to think, well, that stuff that I didn't like is actually not important. The stuff that I don't like, if I told you everything I hated about this painting or didn't like about this painting, you wouldn't have noticed it unless I introduced that to you. So just be mindful that we're going to be our worst critic. Just trust the process. The mistakes are what make it special, and just keep on pushing yourself to create. So this is a brush that I did not treat well. It's a little stuck from ink, but we're going to use that to do some more of the textures. This is going to be primarily gray. I'm going to see how gray our water is to see if we can use it. Yeah, and it looks like it has enough in there to keep on building some more values. Keep in mind your form throughout the piece. Remember when you're using India ink that it's pretty much a permanent fixture. So any paint or oil or acrylic that you add after that, it most likely will not pick it up. The only thing I would recommend is if you're going to introduce watercolor, you do give it at least the day to dry. You can use it in a couple hours or at the end of a day, but you have to be mindful that the paper underneath may still be a little bit damp. And if you introduce a color that's lighter, you might pick up the black that's under it. So the more time you give it to set, the more likely you're not going to have anything pick up from the base of it. Now we're just kind of playing with the values. We can do the wash into the wash that's in the background, just to kind of make sure that we have the information for the shapes of the tree trunk. If we go add a little shadow to this, it looks like that part of the stick is in light, that part has light, but this one drops back under a shadow. Remember, you can use your finger for more textures. What I would recommend is that you dab it and then you kind of carry that part of the wash into the painting. So we're gonna go here. And you could also use it to mimic. So if we want to do kind of like that little circle, do it again. Your old brushes have so much texture and kind of, it's going to give you things that you're not intentionally trying to put into the piece. And then you can try to just work them in here. Again, if I was using a brush that was, a new brush, it's only going to do what I'm putting down on paper. It's not going to give me anything organic. I'm going to have to create all of that organic look. Trying to create something to look organic comes out looking unorganic. It looks very forced. Remember that don't be afraid of your piece. If your piece is primarily black, leave 30% that has white. If your piece is primarily white, try to introduce 30% that will have black. That could be in your shadows. It could be in your figures. But just so that the eye knows what to follow and you have the right information being sent forward to the viewer. Okay, we're going to use the toothbrush. I usually just add a little bit of water and then kind of just go against my ink palette. Pick up whatever's loose. I don't want it super dark. Okay, so we're going to use some torn up paper just to make sure that we're not getting overspray on our background, but it's still going to give us an organic edge. We're going to use that to just introduce a little bit more textures. It's going to give us a nice little weathered tree look. You can also use it off of the paper. So if you want it just to kind of have a little bit of an aim for your direction, but not a sharp edge on where it's hitting. So on both of these pieces so far, we have one big water drop, almost in the same area. Remember that life is not over. You can continue to draw. If you want to pick it up, you can pick it up. I'm going to leave it there for the people that it's bothering so that they can get used to letting art create art. And we're going to just let that dry there, okay? Artists will know. Artists will know. Always try to avoid overworking pieces. Give yourself some time to set, let it set, and give yourself an eye break, look at something else for a little bit, go back to the piece, and then you can decide what it needs. I may go back to this piece. In my head right now, I'm thinking like, oh, I can add some more of the black strokes to go the other way, like we were going to do with the other brush. But that's something that I can let sit for a few minutes and then see if I want to introduce that information later on. So now we're going to go back in and finish this hand. What I want is for the background to drop back just a little bit more. So we're going to build some more of the values here. We're going to make sure that the focal point is just the center of the hand. If you're having a hard time with values on your piece, make sure that you're pushing the right ones. So it's okay that this pinky is the same as the background right now. Remember, this is just based off of our wash. We have all the information that we need to keep on going on the piece. So what we're going to do is just add a little bit more black to make sure that there's a distinguish between the values here, okay? What you could do is squint your eyes to see your values and making sure that they're correct. If they're blending in together, they're going to be blending in together from the viewer. Make sure that you're not too close to your piece. You should stand at least 3 feet away from your painting so that you're able to kind of view it from the viewer's perspective. Sometimes we're kind of get too narrow tunnel visioned in our piece where we're not really focusing on the overall picture, but just on the little parts where you want to make sure that you're kind of tightening it up as you go. So I'm going to just add a little bit of water. We're going to be using kind of like a square tip instead on this one, instead of the round one. So I'm adding just a little bit of water because I want to put black here, but I want to make sure that it's not a hard edge when it lands. Remember, if you're not sure on how dark it's going to look, have just a small piece of paper nearby so you can kind of have like a little bit of a test palette. Another little trick that you can do is, let's say you want to come up to a hard edge with color, with black, but you don't want it to go all the way and have a hard finish on the other side. So if we were going to come up to this, we can dip this in water. So that would be what the stroke would look like before. With the ink, what it's going to do is it's going to create a little transition before your gray. So the water is using kind of the ink to pull it into the brush a little bit more, but it's going to give you that transition so that it's hard black on one side and it transitions to the gray on its own. If you've tried to use ink wash and you try to do a stroke out like that and you want it to get lighter, it won't do it. It needs water to be able to flow with that. This is a trick that you can use to try to keep one side really black and then one side lighter. Now we're pretty much at the end of our painting. What we're going to do is probably the funnest part of art ever, is removing the tape and seeing what these edges look like. It's the most satisfying part of the painting to do. But after we're done with that, we're going to just add a little bit more details to the hand. But once we remove the tape, it's going to kind of give us a good idea of what the focal points will be on the painting. So on the painting, when I was applying it, I was pressing it up against the textures of my shirt and the board so that I would get these kind of unperfect edges. I feel like those give the character, the pieces more character. I enjoy seeing that part in people's work. It's something that I saw at Tom Lea's painting. Seeing the edges of where stuff is not supposed to be seen is so gratifying as an artist, because it's kind of like a little behind the scenes view of art. So I enjoy this part of it. You can do this so that it's cleaner, which is just basically applying the tape immediately and then pressing it down with like a plastic edge and rubbing it into the paper. That's going to make sure that it catches and gives you a really nice seal. But I do like all these little textures that it gives you. I feel like sometimes if you give it too much of a clean edge, people will notice that it's not really perfect. You'll get some kind of variations in the measurements between the borders. So I just like this process a little bit better. Also, when you're working with your washes, try to avoid standing them upright, okay? Keep them flat at all times, because sometimes when we're done, we'll pick them up or we'll move them to the side, and we're not mindful that it is a wet medium. You're gonna get some drips in places that you don't want to get drips on, especially on your clothes. My belly line is gonna be an impression of my paintings all the time because I pick them up and I put them on myself. So just keep that in mind. But I love the composition so far. We're gonna kind of just give it a second to see what we need to fix. I'm gonna add a little bit more of the knuckle values in here and some of the form, but I'm really happy with the end result so far. You can use white paint to fix things that you made a mistake on. I try to avoid that. You could do it if it's going to be for publication work. If this was going to be something that was going to be put in a magazine or be put in any type of print, I would make sure to add some of the white highlights, because then I can fix the levels in Photoshop. But to the naked eye, I just want this to just be ink and water. So I'm going to just give the hand a little bit more form, a little bit more shadows for where these hands are going to be casting a shadow over each other. But I'm going to just have a little piece of paper to make sure that I'm not going too dark. And on your brushes, whenever you're using something, especially on the little details, if you see a glob of water, you have too much water. Try to make sure that it looks damp. It should kind of look like just a marker. Right now, there's a lot. If I just dab it a little bit, it's going to kind of resemble more of like a felt tip. That's what you want. It's going to be almost like using a marker. It's a little cheat code for yourself. If you use a lot of water, you can still get pretty cool impressions, but you're going to have little like watermarks around the edge of where that dries. That's something that you can use in your technique if you want to use it in your technique. For this part, I kind of just want to add some shadows, but without any hard edges. Tom Lea has a piece that's called Juan Sanchez, and in that piece, the horse, my first impression of the horse was that it was so detailed, and I thought like, man, it looks just like a horse, right? But all the information was filled in with my eye, because when I saw it the second time, I realized how dark it was. It was just black, and what happens is that the eye fills in the information that's not needed. So Tom Lea did a great job of making sure that all the information was there for it to read a horse. It looks just like a horse, but all the detail was just in the little highlights. So instead of drawing out all the hand and all the figures and all the wrinkles and everything else like that, if just the highlights have that detail in there, that the mind is going to fill in the rest of the painting for you and for the viewer. So when you're drawing dragon scales, instead of drawing all 1,000 dragon scales, draw the ones that are against the light. Make sure that they all look very detailed. The rest can all drop in shadow, and your viewer will finish that information for you. So here we're going to just fade it up a little bit, but I don't want any paint strokes here. Remember, your finger is going to have an extremely organic texture on it, but it's a great way to push their values into your paintings. Make sure you give your paintings time to sit so that you can go back, view them. I'm going to try to stop here and keep myself from keep on going. And then I'll go back and see what else it needs. But to me, this piece is done. All the important information is there. What I would do after this is you could either roll this into a larger shape paper, and roll it really tight and put a rubber band. That's going to keep, instead of all these bubbles, it's going to give you one solid bend on your paper. But once you press it up against the glass, you won't notice anything. If you leave it just like this and you put it up against glass, you're still going to have your bubbles. So the other thing you could do is, if the piece is small enough, you can put it in between a few books. But I do find that the rolling it up against a bigger piece of paper does help with all of the bubbles that are on your canvas. All right, so this piece is finished. Okay, so we're back to the tree and the tree trunk, the stump and the branches. we still have that little dot. What we're going to do is just kind of work it into the painting. I'm going to use that just like as a little cavity inside of the tree. We're going to add a little bit of more ink lines to go the other way for the tree bark. We're going to use this brush that is also a retired nice brush that is now just a messy brush. So let's start that. First I'm going to dab it just to see if we can pull some of that and give the impression of a little knot here. So everybody that wanted that bubble to be gone, now it's in the whole painting integrated in there. See, it gives it character, just like that. A little bit of ink goes a really long way. So if you have a little cup with a lot of ink, stop. You just need a little tray that you can kind of dip your brush in. So here we're going to just kind of go, after I do this part, since there's going to be kind of big strokes, we're going to remove the tape. I'm going to see if I need to define the tree anywhere else a little bit better. So this right here, the brushes, what it's going to give me is kind of the impression of that bark being a little bit more distressed, a little bit more weathered. It didn't need it. It's just another little piece that if you were working off of a reference or if you studied this part of it a little bit more, you'd say that it's very helpful to add these lines, especially because you can get a little bit more shape from it. So let's take off the tape and see what other things we need to just do to wrap up this painting. So this tape had a cleaner seam against the painting. What I do really like about this piece so far is that the whites that I was able to save throughout the painting are going up against this white that's in the border, and it's giving it a nice little contrast through the piece. Remember, you can go back in with white ink or white acrylic. You can add splatter, you can add more textures the other way. For both of these pieces, I wanted to just keep it just Black India ink and water. Remember that there's always more steps that you can do. You can always add color to these, but for the most part, these pieces are done.